I've long been interested in examining the classical philosophical arguments for God that theists constantly bring up. I was therefore happy when someone suggested this Robert Barron video on Thomas Aquinas and the argument from motion, one of the lesser-known philosophical arguments. I'm sure we all remember that Barron is one of my earliest videos where he made claims about atheism and philosophy, and I proved that he had no fucking clue what he was talking about. Since this video was made before the other, I'm sure it's packed with the same kind of irrationality that Catholic theology is famous for. But hey, we might get lucky, right? So take it away, Father Barron.
Well, one of the unintended but I think happy consequences of the new atheism is a renewed interest in the classical arguments for God's existence. So a lot of Catholic evangelists and apologists, eager to stave off the new atheist critiques, have recovered these rational demonstrations. And the atheists, eager to defend their position, have entered the fray. And I think in the process, these arguments have found a new relevance, and actually in the give and take of both advocates and critics have been refined.
Well, not so much. Yes, old arguments are finding new life, but not because they're actually relevant, but because the religious are very desperate. Every one of these arguments has been soundly refuted in the distant past. That's why they fell out of fashion in the first place. I have no idea what they're expecting by bringing the same arguments up, phrased a little differently, and frankly, more than a little dishonestly, because atheists are not fazed by them at all. They still fail the rational smell test just as miserably today as they did when they were put down decades or centuries ago. But I'm willing to give him a chance to show me wrong.
So I want to revisit Thomas Aquinas, famously gave us 5 arguments for God's existence. But he said there is one that is the first and more manifest way, the argument from motion.
Yes, and all of Aquinas' arguments are nonsensical. They contain irrational leaps of a logic from there might be something there to that something must be our particular incarnation of God. I know I've pointed this out before, but it is important to repeat because the majority of religious philosophical arguments rely on dancing down the primrose path of irrationality, and this, I fear, will be no different.
I can lay it out very simply and schematically. Things move. Nothing moves itself. There can be no infinite regress of moved movers. Hence, there must be some first unmoved mover, and this all people call God.
And immediately he falls right into that irrational shtick. Even if everything he says is true, and it isn't, but even assuming that it is, that doesn't make the unmoved mover God. It doesn't even make it alive. It certainly doesn't make it sentient, and without question, it doesn't make it the Catholic version of God, as Barron wants us to assume. All of these are unjustified steps and unsupported claims that are characteristic of this kind of apologetic thinking. He even goes so far as to say that all people call the supposed thing God. Well, I'm sure it only gets worse from here.
So that's the argument. You can lay it out very simply that way. But now let's examine it a bit to avoid some of the misunderstandings that have happened over the centuries. I mean, from the Middle Ages till today, that argument has been seriously misconstrued. First of all, the word that Thomas uses is motus in Latin. And you can render that as motion in English. But motus has more the sense of change. Not just change of place, what we call motion, so the motion of my hand, but it means any kind of change. So someone growing in knowledge, someone learning a language, being born and dying. I mean, all these are forms of motus in Thomas's sense.
So, essentially, this is just a restatement of many other similar claims, the uncaused cause, etc. Those arguments don't work. Restating them with slightly different words, that won't work any better. Of course, they cannot demonstrate that any of these arguments have any validity in the real world. We certainly can see potential energy become kinetic energy, but that doesn't imply that any intelligent agent causes this change. If a rock rolls down a hill, it converts potential energy, energy that's stored in its physical position, to kinetic energy, energy that is released as the rock is acted upon by gravity, into something useful. But no gods made it roll down the hill. The rock could have been pushed by the wind or disturbed by an earthquake. Again, the idea that someone had to intervene to convert potential to kinetic energy is completely unjustified.
So someone growing in knowledge, someone learning a language, being born and dying. I mean, all these are forms of motus in Thomas's sense. Motus he characterizes as the transition of something from potency to act, from potential reality to actual reality. And once we see that, we see why his second principle holds that nothing can move itself.
But the argument is that some entity, specifically some supernatural entity, is the cause of converting potential to actual energy, a point that is not demonstrated with any kind of evidence whatsoever. If someone is born, lives, and dies, there's no reason to think that any sentient being caused this to happen outside of the individual themselves. It is a wholly empty claim, bereft of any supporting evidence, and thus must be rejected.
And once we see that, we see why his second principle holds that nothing can move itself. If you're undergoing motion, you're in the state of potentiality. Think of someone now who's learning French, right? He doesn't know French. He's potentially in possession of French, but he's undergoing the transition. But the cause of motion must be an act. So the one who's teaching French must know the language and thereby moves the student to actualization. What follows is no one can be both mover and moved at the same time in the same respect. You don't, strictly speaking, teach yourself French. I mean, you might pick up a book on your own, but that means the book is teaching you French. I mean, the guy that wrote the book was in possession of French, etc. So in the strict sense, nothing reduces itself from potency to act.
Actually, that's very easy to disprove. Take a scientist out into the field making observations about the world around them. If said scientist makes a discovery in the field, something that he never knew before, in fact, something that no one in the entire history of man ever knew, then he has done exactly what Barron says cannot happen. He has made a change in himself on his own without anyone forcing the act to take place. This is but one example that I came up with in just a few seconds. Surely Barron should have been able to do the same and realize that what he's saying is utterly ludicrous. Now, I suspect I'm getting ahead of myself, but isn't that exactly what Christians believe that God does? God is the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, the thing that breaks all the rules because they're just going to insist that God gets to be the exception. Nothing can be eternal except God, because they feel like defining God that way. Nothing can be all-powerful except God, because they feel like defining God that way. So how do they actually determine these characteristics that they assign to God? Where did they get this information? Well, they just made it up, of course. They can demonstrate no way of actually having studied God to learn any of these supposed characteristics. It's just that they want them to be true. Therefore, they declare that they are true, and hopefully nobody asks too many questions. Sorry, but in this case, I'm just going to have to ask a lot of questions and point out where your religion fails miserably.
There's no self-moved reality.
Then stop pretending that God gets to be a special case. It's either true or it's not true. If it's true, then there are no exceptions. If it's not true, then there can be any number of potential exceptions. Make up your mind.
So let's suppose something is in motion. It's changing. We therefore know it's being changed by another, by some extrinsic cause. Let's suppose now that that extrinsic cause is itself being moved or being changed. Think, for example, of this stole being moved by my hand, which is here and now being moved by muscles in my arm, which are being stimulated by nerves, which are now grounded in the brain, etc.
You know, it actually helps that if you're going to make an example, that you actually do it on camera. Oh, look, what if this thing over here happens? Yeah, I know you can't see it, but just use your imagination because I can't be bothered to move the camera 6 inches to the left. Come on. I really do want to let him make his points before I tear them down because it's so blatantly obvious where he's going, and his upcoming points are just laughably ridiculous and betray a fundamental misunderstanding of the reality around him. Maybe some part of me unconsciously wants to save him from the embarrassment of making such an absurd point, but I know I have to let him make his own mistakes so that he can learn from them. Not that he ever will, because he clearly can't imagine that these old philosophical arguments could ever possibly be wrong. But anyone with half a clue can already see where they're faulty, so how can he not?
If that which causes the motion is itself being put in motion, it must be put in motion by something extrinsic to itself, and that by another again, that by another again. That process cannot go on indefinitely. Why? Because if I suppress the first element in that chain, then there's no subsequent movers. If there are no subsequent movers, there's no motion.
But that makes some undemonstrated assertions and is a fundamental misunderstanding of the universe around us. See, our particular universe began with the Big Bang, an undeniable fact that is supported by every shred of objective evidence that we have. While we have no way of knowing exactly what came before, and we may never know, we do have some very promising mathematical models that suggest that we're part of a multiverse. If that is true, and it doesn't really matter if it is or not, because regardless, our best information suggests that all of our physical laws were generated in the Big Bang, and that includes things like causality. So without causality, infinite regress is no longer a remote issue. Maybe in whatever other universe that generated ours, there are no laws restricting universal regress. There really is no way to know, and because we can't know, we can't assume things as Father Barron here is doing. The only rational answer, therefore, is we just don't know. We can't base a philosophical argument on something that isn't known, but that's exactly what he's trying to do.
But the motion I can see right before me with my own eyes. Therefore, there has to be, Aquinas concludes, some first element, a first unmoved mover, a first unenergized energizer, a first unactualized actualizer to explain the actualizations taking place within the universe.
Unfortunately for Aquinas, he really had no clue about how the universe actually worked. He didn't know about the Big Bang. He didn't know about quantum mechanics. He didn't know, well, much of anything, and that's certainly not his fault. He just assumed things that are not safe assumptions. But today, we know better. Or at least we know how to ask much better questions about the fundamental existence of reality. But Barron and other apologists have never moved on from the Middle Ages. They still have the same views. They still have the same beliefs and the same arguments as people who died more than 800 years ago. They refuse to move on, and that's why they fail so badly.
There's a comment made by Bertrand Russell, the 20th century philosopher, that I always found remarkably unhelpful in this regard. As he's considering this famous argument, he says, well, the reason Thomas denied infinite series is he just couldn't imagine them, because they hadn't really come into vogue until the 20th century with mathematical logic and so on and so forth. Well, nothing can be further from the truth. Thomas had no trouble whatsoever imagining infinite series. He speculated about them all the time. What he was denying was this particular type of infinite causal series, whereby each element in the chain is here and now dependent upon the one antecedent to it. In that kind of chain, the suppression of the first element would lead necessarily to the suppression of the subsequent elements, and therefore of that change which we can see here and now.
That's actually pretty problematic when you think about it, because if you're thinking in terms of an infinite series, then there is by definition no first cause. There can be no first link in the chain, thus the whole argument falls apart. Plus the fact, if you're going to declare God as the exception to all of your rules, then why don't you likewise just declare other things to be equal exceptions? Why does God get to be the uncaused cause and not the multiverse? Why not some speck of energy out there somewhere? Why does God get to be special and nothing else? Of course, this is just a means to argue that God is real without providing any evidence whatsoever that it's actually so. That's how apologetics works. It's the refusal to admit that you actually have nothing of value to offer, but you can tap dance around your failures and pretend that, by spinning a particular yarn, that you actually have something that you really don't have. And that's exactly what Barron is doing here.
So the conclusion is there must exist this first, call it unactualized actualizer. And then the little tagline at the end, this all people call God.
Which is, of course, entirely untrue. Personally, I call it a delusion, or wishful thinking. Hell, you can call it Fred for all I care, but it is nonsensical to think that all people everywhere call this thing that you haven't demonstrated exists God. It's just an attempt to force sectarian religiosity into an entirely non-religious argument.
Now, at this point, there are some agnostics and atheists who say, the argument's fine. I think the argument is logically airtight. They know that an infinite causal series violates the principle of sufficient explanation. I mean, if you say, it just goes back indefinitely, well, you haven't explained anything. They understand that it's a violation of this most fundamental law of science, that you've got to find a sufficient explanation. But they will balk at that little tagline at the end, and this all people call God. What they'll say, especially today, look, there might be a first mover, okay, an unactualized actualizer, but it's just matter itself, or it's energy. Often they'll point to the law of the conservation of energy, that energy never really comes into being or passes away, it just assumes different forms forever and ever. So the fundamental stuff, if you want, the unmoved mover, is energy.
No, the unmoved mover, even if we were going to accept that this thing might exist, and I'm not agreeing to that, I'm just saying what if, the only thing that we can say about that mover is that we have no way of actually saying anything whatsoever about that mover. We simply cannot make any determination about what this thing might actually be. We can't say if it's alive or not. We can't say if it's sentient or not. We can't even say if it still exists or not. We can literally say nothing whatsoever coherent about this thing, assuming that it exists at all. The reason we can't say anything about it is exactly the same reason that theists cannot demonstrably argue for any characteristics of their God, simply because we have nothing coherent to look at and study and learn what these characteristics might actually be. There's a lot of Christians who are only too happy to tell you everything about their God, what he wants, how he acts. Heck, you can probably find people out there who will tell you what his favorite flavor of ice cream is. These are the same people who think Jesus, if he ever existed at all, was white and spoke English. But no matter how many times they tell you all of this information, we have to keep asking how they actually got it and how they actually tested it to see if it is factually true. If they can't do that, if they can't provide the evidence that shows that their claims are true, then their claims are nonsensical and irrational, just like the idea that we should take this undemonstrated thing, this thing for which no evidence exists, this thing that you cannot possibly study or learn anything about, and just arbitrarily call it God and pile on it all sorts of undemonstrated characteristics, wishes, and dreams. That's not how logic works, sorry.
Well, here's the problem. See, if you follow Thomas's argument, the conclusion you come to is this reality, which provides actualization, but is itself not actualized. It is therefore actus purus. That means pure act. Actus translates into Latin energeia in the Greek. I love that. It's a term that Aristotle used a lot. Energy. The real first mover, if you've really come to this reality, you found that thing which is utterly energized in its being. That means realized in its being. And can, in principle, receive no outside influence because it's the first element in this causal chain.
All of which, let's be honest, he's just pulling straight out of his ass. As I said, we can know nothing whatsoever about this supposed first cause. For all you know, again, assuming it exists at all, there could have been an entire species of these first movers. It could have been a science experiment in some extra-dimensional scientist's laboratory. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that a scientist started suggesting that maybe we could set off our own Big Bang and create another pocket universe. If we could do that successfully, maybe in a couple of billion years, intelligent life in that pocket universe might be asking themselves the same question that Barron is asking. Does that make us gods? I don't think so.
Matter or energy cannot be this reality. Why? Because matter, or to use the more contemporary term, energy, is by its very nature infinitely malleable. Matter exists in this particular configuration. It could be in 1,000 different configurations. If you say matter, you mean something of a particular color, shape, size, location, velocity. You say energy, you mean, well, energy in what form, what configuration, at what quantum level, right? Matter or energy are potential, to use the classical philosophical language. They have a certain actuality, but they're marked by an extraordinary potentiality.
Now you have to remember that both Father Barron here and Thomas Aquinas in the distant past, they both have a vested interest in getting to the idea of their God, an idea held in blind faith and totally without any objective evidence. They're not making this argument in a vacuum. They have a specific goal in mind. They don't want to take the argument and see where it leads. They want to push the argument to a specific conclusion, and that is, by definition, dishonest. It isn't how philosophical arguments, and it isn't how science is done. It comes as no surprise that theists like Barron and Aquinas would do everything they can to force things to turn out the way that they want it to turn out. That's why Aquinas put in the entirely superfluous and everyone calls it God nonsense. It's made to bridge the gap between what may be a decent argument and an entirely unjustifiable religious beliefs. They're just hoping that nobody recognizes it.
And now, do a little thought experiment. I've been hinting at it already. Imagine some existing thing. So this stole, or one of these books on the bookshelf. There is matter in a particular configuration, but it could be in a million other configurations. Therefore, we're compelled to ask, and see, it lies behind all of science. We're compelled to ask, well, what put it in that particular form? Now I begin looking for extrinsic causes. Well, I say, well, sure, the publisher put the matter in that particular form, colored it that particular way. Fine. It could be 1,000 other forms, but it's in that form because of an extrinsic cause.
But let me stop him right there because he's already going off the rails, or at the very least, he's hinting that he's about to leap the tracks. The idea that somebody put something into a particular form, made it a particular color, he's assuming intelligence and purpose where there is no demonstrable intelligence or purpose. Oh sure, we know that books are created by people. We have no examples of bound books being produced by nature. We recognize things that were created by an intelligent mind because we have direct and personal experience with intelligent minds creating things. However, if you look at a rock, what created a rock? What decided that it would have this particular shape or this particular color? Most people would say that nothing did that. Rocks are the shapes that they are because of how they've worn over time. They are the color that they are because of their chemical composition and how they've interacted with other elements in the environment. Nobody with half a clue thinks that there are rock-creating gnomes out there designing every single rock and every single tree and every single drop of water. All of these things are completely natural. They exist because of the natural laws of our universe, not because of some intelligence. But let's see if Father Barron is going to jump this shark or not.
Now, is that cause itself potential? Was it put in that form by another cause? Well, yeah, you say, sure, it was. That process cannot go on infinitely. Otherwise, we've explained nothing. If we simply appeal indefinitely to material causes, we haven't solved our problem because matter remains essentially potential. But the unmoved mover is actus purus.
And of course, he does. He's clearly not trying to discover the truth. He's not looking at the evidence and letting it lead to a conclusion. He has a conclusion in mind, and he's carefully guiding the evidence, paying attention only to things that can help him and ignoring the things that don't, trying desperately to get to that conclusion that he's already concluded. He even says so here himself. If he doesn't get to that first cause he's looking for, he hasn't answered the question the way he wants it answered. It's all pretty telling, isn't it?
See, now you understand why Thomas can say, this all people call God. Once you understand the nature of the real unmoved mover, who is utterly realized in his being, who's completely energized in his existence, that which experiences no ontological restriction whatsoever. Actus purus is that which exists through the power of its own essence. What's God's name in the book of Exodus? What's your name? I am who I am. Do you see now why Aquinas, borrowing this, of course, from Aristotle, but can very reasonably make the correlation between actus purus, the unmoved mover, and what all people call God?
Okay, wait a minute. Why does that guy on the left have his pants down? Did God get off looking at this guy's ass? Alright, that's gotta be one of the weirdest ideas in all of classical art. But anyhow, Now Barron goes off and just makes up a whole bunch of stuff that cannot be drawn in any way, shape, or form from the argument itself. It's a desperate attempt to shoehorn his own ideas about God into the argument. And by the time you get to the end, where he's just making claims that he cannot justify based on blind faith and wishful thinking, it's no wonder that modern atheists don't take these ancient philosophical arguments at all seriously. There's a reason these arguments went away for many, many, many years. People saw through the ridiculous nature of these religious hand-wavium jobs even then. It's too bad that people like Barron are unaware that we're even smarter than that now. Waxing philosophical is difficult, especially when you're faced with people who don't do philosophy very well. Lots of Catholics are really impressed with the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas, but they're really all faulty and often for exactly the same reasons. The argument from motion is just begging the question in more ways than one. If God is the first mover, what motivated God to make his first motion? If that cannot be answered, or if God just gets to be a magical exception, then we still have no demonstrated answers. But that really doesn't matter to the theist. They're not out to get to the truth, whatever the truth is. They're out to justify their pre-existing religious beliefs, whether they're true or not. Logic. They're just doing it wrong. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned something, especially if you believe in any of these piss-poor philosophical arguments. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share, and make a note to come back for my next video, which ought to be showing up anytime now.